I'll do my best to sort of kick off what I think that we might be able to accomplish in the time that we have together. And I apologize, I do believe that we were supposed to start at 10:30 and we go until 11:15. So I'd be interested in kicking off some ideas. We've already got some prompts there to cover, but I think what I'll do is ask people to go around the virtual room to introduce themselves. And I have a list that's based on the participant list that's presented at mine. So I'll just call on people to introduce themselves. Let me start with, I think Ananda has just joined, and Ananda, I think you're just in time to introduce yourself.
Hi, Owen. This is Ananda Roy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm Ananda Roy from NIH Common Fund. I lead several programs at at Common Fund, and I also have my own research program focusing on transcription analysis of immune cell activation.
Okay, great. Great to have a representative from Common Fund. And Carol.
Hi, I'm Carol Thompson. I am a technical project manager at the Allen Institute. I'm part of the Brain Cell Data Center, that's the organizing hub for the Brain Initiative Cell Census Network. And I'm interested in us discussing some of these strategies around where data lives, that helps enable this data integration and data sharing, and continues to be finding ways that are efficient and effective.
Great. Roderico, introduce yourself.
Who?
Roderico.
Oh, yes, sorry, this is myself, Rodrigo. Yeah, I'm Rodrigo from the Center of Genomic Regulation in Barcelona. I'm led the Bioinformatics and Genomics program, doing research in computational biology, transcriptomics in general. I'm part of the ENCODE and Digitex projects.
Okay, great. And then John Holt. Can you introduce yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Cool. Hi, John Holt here. I work for Boehringer Ingelheim in Connecticut, and I work in the cancer immunology space and been dealing a lot with single cell data of late. So excited to, solve some problems.
Okay, great. And Satra?
Hi, everyone. My name is Satra. I'm at MIT. I'm part of the BICCN consortium and a PI of one of the Brain Initiative archives called DANDY, which is for cellular neurophysiology data. But in general, I've done a lot of work in informatics and data sharing. And with the scale of data that's going to come online, this seemed like a very appropriate group to kind of chat with.
Yeah, okay. And Ananda, we got you, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I think one of the things that this means is that we may not have a representative from HCA unless Carol wants to advertise herself as that.
I am not. I need to talk to people at HCA more. I'm not actually involved with the HCA stuff.
Okay, all right. So that's okay. I think that there is some useful business that we can conduct.
Well, I am part of the HCA, but actually I am co-chair of the ethics working group, so it's not very relevant to the.
Okay. Yeah.
To
Great. So that's fine. I do think that there's some things that we could talk about. Let me just kick off this discussion by saying that we only have a short period of time to talk, and it's not uncommon for breakout sessions to essentially have some agreements that, democracy is a good thing or motherhood is a good thing, and not really necessarily have any positive outcomes from that. So I think what would be really useful is if we could just speculate a little bit on what types of things would jumpstart some activities going forward. If we just established kind of an initial framework or mode of relating to each other, I think that would be as probably one of the best outcomes as possible. The discussion prompts that you see there were written by me, and they don't really talk directly to that. And I will try to, if we don't have people sort of volunteering things, I will try to drive some of the discussion based on the prompts that we have there. But the sort of larger picture for me is, if we could, as an outcome of this, just make some recommendations for how we could go forward. And the organizers were pretty good about this kind of, how might we? I think they're very interested in seeing some outcomes from this that would be tangible potential working groups for us, just sort of more effectively, just developing some type of framework for, let's say, in our case, interoperation. The other thing I want to say is that it's very easy for people to discuss interoperation in a lot of different levels. And in our case, I think that what we're talking about is essentially a form of federation, where federation means that data exists at multiple sites, just like when we all go to the Department of Motor Vehicles in New Jersey or California or other places. They have their own data that's associated with any of those states, but they've developed protocols for actually sharing data from one site to another. And that allows you to ask questions like, give me all the people who have gotten a ticket for speeding at one site compared to another. I don't think that we're ever going to be in a world anymore where we can talk about centralization of data. I think we need to be talking about the procedures and administration that's associated with linking data at lots of disparate different sites. So I'll start with saying that I'm going to probably ask us to constrain our thinking a little bit in that sense. So I think life is about federation and what that actually means. So maybe what I'll do is start the discussion by asking people for describing experiences that they have where they've seen effective federation of data, or they've had the experience of being able to link between data sets from one site and another site. And I will argue that most of the time that has not really happened, that there are not cases where the end user is really able to do that. But do people have examples in their mind of ways that might work? Anybody on the call?
So, Owen, I don't know whether this is going to be the most relevant because this is not really my expertise, but I can tell you from the Common Fund experience that when we had the epigenomics program, roadmap epigenomics program, and so we generated obviously a whole lot of data, but that was also linked to the ENCODE data sets, which was a completely different initiative. Yeah. And that really worked well because right now, all the epigenomics data you can access through the ENCODE data sets.
Okay.
So that is one example where it has worked really, really well between the two data sets, although those were somewhat related data sets, but it was a very effective use of that mechanism.
So that's wonderful that you've got a positive example. Do you know that much about what was involved with the implementation of that? And also, let me ask you to describe, what was the user's experience? Did they still go to one website to be able to access it?
So I don't know the technical details of what it entailed, because this was done like 7 or 8 years ago, even before I joined NIH.
Okay.
So I don't know the history of that, but I can tell you that the user experience has been really, really positive because people really, I mean, the ENCODE program has ended. Sorry, the epigenomics program has ended. So people can really access all the data sets of the ENCODE data, the epigenomics data set through the ENCODE data set. So, so that has been a really positive experience for people.
Yeah, yeah.
So let me continue on this because I'm part of ENCODE, and I totally agree with what has been said. Actually, it goes beyond the epigenomics roadmap, because it also includes other projects like the Blueprint in Europe under the umbrella of the International Human Epigenomics Consortium, IHEC.
Right.
And actually, IHEC has several working groups that are working towards defining standard pipelines, standard formats, and other procedures that can be used across different epigenomics data sets. So it's actually not only US based, but it's actually beyond US, including, I'm not sure also whether Phantom is part of this IHEC, but that's actually, I think, a good example of how people from different sides in the world generating data that has similar features are working together to try to make this data interoperable.
Yeah, so that's an excellent point, actually, Rodrigo, because I'm also part of the IHEC Executive Committee, and so that is a terrific example where data from Europe, deep, and the Netherlands and Japan and Singapore, Canadian groups, they're all part of the IHEC, and that's all linked data. So that has really worked well, and it continues.
Okay, so let me pounce on that. If we have good examples of that, what are sort of the larger, bigger picture issues that you got from that experience that you think could map to what we're doing? So let me give one example. A lot of times it is very challenging to know what we want to achieve within our operation in the absence of having clear use cases. So having a team of people that are thinking about use cases can be very helpful. That might be an example. So I'm looking for something at that level.
Right.
So guys, if you had this positive experience and you were there in the trenches showing how this happened, could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Owen, could I follow up that question? I think as they think about this, how can we learn from that experience?
Yes,
in
exactly.
Trying to move that outside of that specific domain to kind of this federated model that Owen referred to?
That's exactly my motivation. Absolutely. So guys, what do you know about that in terms of how that project was stood up?
So let me try the first shot at that. And so what really worked, particularly in terms of IHEC, is that there were willing partners from different countries. So that involved both the government representatives as well as scientists. So we have had two different committees. One is the executive committee, which is more of the administrative side, as well as we have the international scientific community, where scientists, representatives from different countries came together, and they all contributed to not only depositing and contributing to data sets, but also deal with the daily operational issues and how really to coordinate between the different countries. And so that is a model that has worked well with IHEC.
Okay. Anybody?
And I think if I can also add, I think there is still this active group, which is the Reference Epigenomic Standards Working Group, which are actually developing both the standards for talking about use cases, which sort of pipelines should be used for RNA-seq, for instance, or for ChIP-seq, how to call the peak, so that makes the data of the different projects comparable, so that actually you can use ENCODE and Blueprint or Phantom data or whatever in a way which is comparable. So I think the effort of trying to build these standards, I think it's something that's actually very, very important.
Okay,
and
so
this has worked. I mean, and it's actually working still. There is this. I mean, if you go to the IHEC webpage, you will see the reference epigenomic standards, where actually the documents, there are already documents that have been created in order to detail all these recommendations and standards.
Right. So let me leverage that statement. One of the things I just have so many experiences with people discussing interoperation, and one of the things that frequently comes up is it's not uncommon for people to question Hang on, I've got a siren.
While you're hanging on, I'm just going to check and make sure that you've got someone scribing the questions in the Google Doc here.
Yeah, we're good. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Just wanted to
Okay.
be sure. Thanks very much.
Sorry, people. I'm in Baltimore, and there's the occasional siren. So one of the things that frequently comes up is people question: does it even make sense to be sharing data in the sense that if it's being processed differently from one site to another, it often means that it may not be comparable. So when we talk about interoperation, I think that this group would agree that one element of it would be for us to address if common pipelines are being used, or at least let's say harmonized pipelines are being used for the HCA and other projects. Is that a reasonable thing to say? Does anybody have a response to that?
Yes, so that is what we follow at the IHEC model, that you have what you just exactly said, that is agreed upon through monthly meetings. So there's continuous dialogue between the participants every month, really to hash these out and to agree upon certain joint standards, joint pipelines, and joint analysis.
Okay. So I'll translate that in terms of going forward. This group would agree that in all likelihood, what we would have to do is somehow address standardization of the data processing if we were going to be talking about interoperation.
Yes.
So,
but one thing, with an HCA, there's actually the strong group, the DCP, the data coordination, the DCP, that data coordination platform, which actually the role of which is precisely one of the roles is to set up these standards. So HCA already has putting a lot of effort into standardizing all the analysis across the multiple partners and sites, and actually not only this, experimental protocols and types of assays that are being employed in the HCA. So this effort already, it's actually one of the main, I would say, is one of the strongest components of the human cell atlas, and it's one of the things that's actually heavily funded by the Frank-Zuckerberg Foundation, CCI.
On that front, can I ask a quick question, which is how do you balance kind of standardized things where practices are established versus new things? So as new tools are built, that's kind of becomes an exploratory space. So in these large projects, often that's left to individual labs to kind of play around and toy around with. And that coordination does not happen till something kind of gets into a standard space. To move things faster, how do you kind of balance that?
Yeah, so what is useful is to have a mechanism for there to certainly be this sort of Cambrian period of, explosion of lots of different analysis techniques. You don't ever want to stand in the way of that. And what's useful is to have some type of working group or some type of process that it essentially can kind of capture the best of breed for those methods. And then when there's some reasonable level of agreement about those methods, to then try to apply them to all the data sets that are out there in some way, or at least harmonize them. So one data set is reasonably compared to another data set. So that's a big element to this process is, even if you fully achieved federation, you need to have your data processed in a way that would make it meaningful to be joining it across data sets.
So I don't know if everybody here is aware, but one thing that we're trying to do in the BICCN between NEMO and the Broad Institute is have this common cloud computing pipeline so that we can process transcriptomic and epigenomic data in the same way. And the point is that we'd be using the same pipelines as, for instance, the Human Cell Atlas. So that's two consortia on board. So part of this might not just be about data storage and data movement, but the shared processing pipeline. So to that point of how can we support interoperability when you have data generated in different places, and processing is a big piece of that, I think.
Yeah.
And that's something that a couple of the consortia we're starting to look at, but I think the hope is like, how do we engage that broader conversation across the many consortia that are part of the NIH world at this point?
Yeah.
So this is Bill Shy. I'm new to the group here. I was in
Welcome.
another group that folded, so I just picked another one. And I came in partway in the conversation, so I'll second or third or fourth this effort. Unfortunately, I'm in HubMap. I'm the wrong person to really be talking about the pipelines. I know what's going on there, but I'm not implementing or giving help to implement this stuff.
That's fine.
So maybe I'll try to reach out. I mean, I'll pay attention here, but I'll try to get some information to the folks at CMU who are doing this work.
Yeah.
Right now.
But
I'm
Bill,
sure they would agree. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you just shout out what you are doing with HubMap? I mean, we got a chance to introduce ourselves, so I'd just be curious.
Right. So you mean what my role is in HubMap?
Yeah.
Right. So I'm crossing a lot of things. So I work at University of Pittsburgh. I'm part of the infrastructure group in HubMap.
Yeah.
So we're, putting together where we store the data, how do we access the data, all that kind of stuff. How do we, any software that we use for ingesting the data, that kind of stuff, which includes for the ingest, we have, we ingest, then we run pipelines. Some pipelines may get run at the labs as well, and then we're ingesting that data and we're tracking all this, and I'm a lot with the provenance of both the tissue where the data comes from and then the data. So we're tracking the doing all the provenance. So all of that work, I'm building the infrastructure. My team is building infrastructure, sort of the software pieces around that.
Okay.
Do that. And we do have, so we have, I don't know how many, we have many different assay types across imaging, and
right.
We have mass spec, we have sequencing, we have just, there's a bunch, there's some combinational things that people were doing, some pretty cool science going on. Okay. But so as far as pipelines are going, we're sort of taking it, assay by assay and looking at it, and so we've done some stuff for 10x and for other RNA-seq kinds of things so far that might be relevant to what you guys are talking about. But
so for you and for other people who may have just joined, we've only got 15 minutes, and what I would be very happy with is if we could talk a little bit about whatever general infrastructure, et cetera, we can kind of be, or any approach that we could agree collectively would be important for us to be developing interoperation or federation from other sites. Because HubMap is such a significant player in this landscape, would you like to just give us a real quick idea? We're ending in 15 minutes from now. Just a general picture of what is mobilized so far relevant to federation that may also map or be used for other activities for the people that are represented here.
I have just one question. We are continuing after the breakdown, right? We are continuing. Yes. This is just the first part of the session, right? We have after. This continues after.
Oh, I was not aware.
Yeah, part two is
we have further outward, I think.
Okay, all right.
Part two is solutions. Part one is questions. Right?
Okay, fair enough.
Yep. So in terms of kind of, I think, Owen, the question you asked would be a perfect thing to help answer in part two, kind of looking at HubMap things. One of the questions I have for people is, there is a lot of diversity of data sets out there that we are dealing with. How are we thinking about the scale of data? So kind of coming back to data storage and movement. And as Carol says, the compute to data attachment is what really kind of brings about data storage and movement. So across the NIH-HCA consortia, we're probably looking at many different scales of data.
Yeah.
And so could we come up with a strategy? And I think this is where part of the questions, part of the early discussion on what has worked, it sounded like that was focused on very specific data sets and data elements. So could that model be extended to a larger scope of and scale of data?
Yeah, let me just comment that I think in the landscape that we exist, where there are many different modalities, a bare minimum, honestly, would be to simply have inventories of all the data sets that are out there. And that, I'm involved with a Common Fund project. Common Fund has 15 different data coordinating centers. And we really regard as kind of level 0, just being able to find the inventory of information like this site has this many metabolomic data sets, this site has RNA-seq and that type of thing. Can I ask the group to agree that it would be valuable for us to just start thinking about a standard that would allow people to describe these inventories? In my mind, that would be fantastically valuable. And keep in mind that like GA4GH is an example of a standard that's meant to describe mostly variant files. And they do hope to kind of extend what they have in mind to work for other data sets. But there really isn't something that has emerged where you could simply find out what the inventories are for every site. We're doing that at Common Fund. And I'm not pushing that we would use that implementation strategy, but that concept of being able to find inventories would be useful. Is there agreement with the group that that would be valuable or possible?
Yes, from me.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes.
I agree.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I have a link to our standard and everybody can start to adopt it, but I don't think that is
So just one thing, you mentioned the Global Alliance. Actually, the HCA is the driver project of the Global Alliance, the Human Cell Atlas. So there is already some relationship between HCA and the Global Alliance, and in principle, they're participating in the RNA-Get, which is the API for the getting RNA data. But at the end, HCA actually listed out because of what HCA understands as a standard and what the Global Alliance understands for a standard, which is slightly different.
And maybe to follow up on Rodrigo's point a little bit, I don't think there's a lack of standards. The question is, how do we get alignment or adoption of something that works and evolves? So I think kind of that's, if we could as a group kind of work towards that, because that's the part that has been challenging, because it's often tied to existing implementations. And so people don't want to walk away from their existing implementations as an evolution of a standard would require. And so as a consortia, I think that's where the strength would come in, is the ability to put resources towards aligning towards a standard and being able to walk away from existing implementations a little bit, because as a consortia, there's an agreement towards it. So
I'm a very process-oriented person. I feel like a lot of times people can have orthogonal conversations about sort of an implementation approach where like GA4GH would solve everything. I don't believe that. What I believe is that an organizational approach kind of has to come first, where in a sense, you simply agree there are a lot of standards and evaluate the whole question from the angle of what does it take people who have very different funding sources, very different alliances. HubMap has their source of support, HCA has their source of support. There's not that much institutional and administrative requirements for people to work together other than just sort of paying lip service to the people who are supplying them with a check. And so I do like the idea of this group thinking a bit about what does that organizational structure look like. That is extremely valuable to approach the problem that it's much more of a social science issue than it is anything else.
Right.
Does that ring a bell for anybody?
Yes. And so I think what Satra was also raising, and you are clearly articulating that having different groups working on omic standards versus imaging data versus mass spec data, because these are obviously different types of data, different scales. So again, I go back to the IHEC model, that is what we are, because IHEC, although started with just the epigenomics data, is now expanding to more like the 4D nucleome type of data, as well as single cell hub map type of data.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do think about that having different groups coming together on these different data types and having regular conversation on that where they stand, what do they have, and how do we go forward.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually, from time to time, the different groups meet to see where they are in terms of what they have achieved and what are the recommendations going forward. Might work as it has worked with IHAC.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to say in the second half of the day, we've got the metadata schemas and ontology session, and I'd like to feel that how might we to take over to the federated data standards subtopic.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's very relevant. I think we'd like to talk about that a little bit more this afternoon.
Yeah. So again, I'm mostly looking for some types of outcomes that could come from this that we have an agreement. Go ahead, Carol.
I have one that I'd like to bring up, which I feel like when I looked at some of your beginner pointers or discussion prompts at the beginning, one of the things that keeps coming up at the Allen Institute is we're part of the Brain Initiative Cell Census Network, and we're part of HCA.
Yeah.
And I just keep hearing everybody all the time saying, well, let's just put all our data in both, right? We want our data to be analyzable against the BICCM. We want our data to be analyzable against the HCA. Oh, and there's other data types too. Let's have it at the Allen Institute and at Dandy, or maybe it can just be at Dandy. What do? Do we keep it here? Do we have it in both places? If there's multiple archives in multiple consortia that are handling data, what is it that we do? So I think this is one of the things we want to solve for. Everybody wants their data. They've got data that belongs to multiple groups. I mean, I look at like Aviv earlier was presenting. She belongs to I don't know how many different consortia. And she's generating data that somebody might want to cross-analyze at some point. It's all generated in the same way by her lab, but ultimately it's going to live in these different places. So how do we address this, keeping in mind that, you know, if I channel the FAIR data stuff, you know, and I channel Marianne, there's supposed to be one source of record, right, for the actual data, but people want it accessible from multiple places. I mean, it ties into all these other things we're discussing.
Yeah.
In terms of processing needs to be standardized so you can analyze things across data, but how do we create this infrastructure where people don't need to create copies of this stuff everywhere, and that you can actually, we can address this desire of people to replicate their data in every single consortium?
Yeah. So, I mean, I will say this sort of an Owen White opinion is that the issue of imagining, okay, there's multiple resources and I'm just going to have data collections that exist at multiple resources, and we're talking about movement of the raw data, that's probably a non-starter. It won't scale, and there's a point at which when you look at the cost, it's absolutely prohibitive. So I'll just put out there that, for example, with the Common Fund, which is 15 plus projects, or with the sort of GA4GH scope of things, the idea is that data stays where data stays, and you have a relatively small, lightweight way of describing the inventory of that data at lots of different sites, and that inventory gets moved to a central repository or is some way accessible to the world. And I think you could call that loose federation. And I think that's probably the only way that we'll be able to move forward.
So on that front, could I bring up three things that were in the discussion, which I don't think we've touched on? Long-term archiving or storage of data. I mean,
Yeah.
Who supports it? Who provides? I mean, all of this requires not just bits and bytes on a disk, but dollars to support the long-term piece.
Yeah.
Second thing is, if they're not going to move, that means compute has to happen next to it, which also requires resources that come alongside it.
Yes.
Is that a consortial place to say we provide both storage plus compute next to it? And then the third piece is, once you have storage, and it goes back to the interoperability and federation question, you may need to aggregate things across different sources to compute on.
Yeah.
So it is a complex ecosystem where it may not be that storage can just be local. And we
Yeah.
can talk about solutions in the second half, but I wanted to kind of bring up that we do want to consider data from the perspective of scale, what compute is required, even if they're standardized pipelines, and the multimodal component, which is coming online with these new consortia, that it's not just one type of, it's different types of data that needs to be integrated, and what that means for data storage and movement.
Yeah.
And I think I want to tag on to that, actually. I like, because I've been sort of, while listening this whole time, been thinking about the concept of modularity, you know, so like in processing, you really start with a very raw form of data and you move on into more and more complicated forms. And I think in light of thinking about storage and minimizing costs and maximizing accessibility, I want to kind of pose a question, you know, is there a point in the processing of this data? And by this data, I'm mostly referring to single cell data, the sequencing data. Is there like a place, a format that's sort of like an endpoint for where we leave that data where it resides, and then sort of having downstream processing of multiple data sets be something that happens client side? So wherever a user wants to access all this data, that's where you're going to be performing compute. And maybe this ties into the question of who pays for that, you know, ultimately. But, you know, for example, FastQ is very standardized format.
All right, folks, I'm going to ask you all to open the document, which I bet you already have a link for, thanks to our organizers, but I will put it in the chat buffer. And I would like to help start out this session. My situation is that I failed to understand that this was a two-parter, and I have another conference call that I can't get out of. So I will start with the discussion, helping with the discussion, and then I'd like to ask Carol Thompson, and also Anoop Maherkar is on the call, and he certainly represents a lot of the technical background that I have for data sharing, et cetera. And I hope between the two of you, you could prompt people to continue with the call even after I take off. We had there's some new people here, and I'll just introduce some of the stuff that we talked about. We had a very productive conversation. We sort of started out talking about positive examples of federating data, and code came up. There was a sort of a general understanding that there are a number of different issues associated with any type of federation, including trying to ensure that data processing is handled in some type of common way, or maybe another approach might be that you could associate provenance associated with data, so people could at least know how it was processed. There was a pretty good understanding that we have incredibly disparate data sets, and we need to be trying to work towards that we have all these different sort of modalities for that data, and it would be useful to come up with some type of way to describe them. This is very much my bias, but I think something that would be very important is for us to be trying to, given that there's wild differences in the type of data that many of these large projects are collecting, it would be useful to just at least start by being able to inventory all the data sets in some type of common way, so we'd be able to find them at the different sites. And there's a recognition that there are some efforts out there technically that are setting up to be able to do that. And then this was definitely a direction that I tried to push the conversation, but I think it's very helpful to ask the question, look, if we know that there are standards there for describing data, what else is needed? What type of administrative overhead, what type of governance, how is it that people will sort of be interacting with each other to agree on which particular standard or which particular way we would go about engaging in federation? I would say that that's kind of where we left off. It was a very productive discussion, and now I'd like us to be trying to drive this direction even further towards what types of things would be needed to successfully stand up some type of cross consortia collaboration. And this really is a cross consortia. There are large consortia that are being funded, networks of people that are being funded like HubMap under one source of funding, and then there's also HCA. So those are like two different consortia. I represent BICCN and also the Common Fund. That's another consortia. And so we're trying to get outside of scoping it just by having one funding source for these different projects. Carol and Anoop, I know that you've just been thrust into the position of trying to keep the discussion going. Would you like to lead off with any comments before we just open it up to the group?
Oh, and a quick question. So I know in the notes that they said we should assign scribes. Have you already done that for this session, or do we need to do that?
So I'll just ask who would like to help with some of the scribing? Carol helped with the last time, but could we get somebody who's a designated scribe to take notes?
I can continue.
Satra took a lot of the notes the first
Okay,
time.
great. All right, thanks very much.
Thanks,
But
Satra and
we
Carol.
do need 2 scribes.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have Satra, and could one other person volunteer? Well, Carol and Anoop, I think you're going to have to tag team on that one.
Okay.
All right, folks, I hate to be that person, but we live in a very disorganized world, and I did not understand that I was also scheduled to be working through noon, but I have to take off. So good luck with everything, and I will check in after my call and take a look at the progress. So thanks a lot, people.
Sure. I think, so in this session, the first session was supposed to be coming up with some questions that we might want to answer in the second session. And we did not finish up the first session by deciding on specific ones to try to address in the second session. So I think the first thing that we probably need to do is look at those and coalesce around 1 or 2 of these questions that we'd like to try to develop a little bit more of a plan for how we might follow up across different consortia for collaborating on finding potential solutions for these. Does that sound right, everybody?
Yeah.
Just wanted to. One thing that I would like to do, because we have a number of new participants this time around, is just make sure, let's see how many new, not too many new folks. Maybe we could all say our name again very quickly and what consortium and institution we are representing. So I'm Carol Thompson. I'm at the Allen Institute for Brain Science, and I'm here on behalf of the Brain Initiative Cell Census Network. Roderick? You're on mute still.
Yes, sorry, you want us to introduce again ourselves?
Just, name, institution, and consortium.
Roderick, I'm Roderick Gigo. I'm from the Center of Genomic Regulation in Barcelona, and I'm mostly related to the human cell atlas. I co-chair of the ethics working group.
Thank you. How about Bill?
Yeah, so I'm Bill Shirey, University of Pittsburgh, and I'm part of the HubMap consortium.
Great, thank you. John, and then Benjamin. John, we can't hear you. Okay, let's go to Benjamin.
Hi, I'm Ben Hitz. I run the ENCODE Data Coordination Center at Stanford.
Great. Satra?
Hi, I'm Satra. I'm at MIT. I'm a PI of one of the brain archives on cellular neurophysiology and part of the BICCN consortium.
Thank you. Let's see, who else do we have in here? It was Alan, right?
There's Ananda Roy that I see on the call.
Hi, this is Ananda Roy. I'm from NIH Common Fund. I co-lead HubMap along with Richard Conroy and among 7 other Common Fund programs.
Okay, great. And I think it's just Anup, right?
Yeah. So I'm Anup Mavkar. I'm at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, and I'm a co-investigator on NEMO, which is one of the archives for Brain Initiative, where we handle mostly genomics data.
Okay, great. So then Owen had already done, excuse me, a recap of some of the questions that we're looking at. I hope everybody's had an opportunity to open up the Google Sheets so that you can look at what was written. So I guess this is where we could open it up quickly to find out if we can, what things people are most interested in following up on in this session. The best way to do this. Okay.
So I'll just speak up. So there were two things that I heard talked about in the last one. The first was you know, where does the data reside and do you move the data? You know, does it have to be moved for compute, or do you come to the data with compute? So I think that was a pretty huge thing there. The first related to this topic. The second thing was, how do you find the data? Do we have some standard and then some search capability that is cross consortia? You know, a standard of publishing what data I have and then some searching across consortia, which I think is where that was going. Do we need something like that? I don't know if that's the kind of question we're looking for here, but those seemed like two pretty important topics for this to me.
I would second those two things. I think search of data across consortia is kind of critically important as we think about the different kinds of things. And that will require both agreement and technological solutions, and then the data movement piece.
Any other thoughts?
Oh, and I will say what we can learn from those other existing projects to help towards those two things, because they seem to have done some of this in those projects.
Okay, do you think would everybody be on board then if we focus our next session then on, as someone said, where does the data live and do you move it, and then how do you find the data? So those are two large topics actually that could be in different places. The finding data, having a central way to, or a common way to inventory data so that you can find it across different consortia, is not necessarily connected, can be separable from this other topic of where does the data live and do you move it? And to recap, some of that discussion on where does the data live and do you move it has to do with people are generating data, they belong to multiple consortia, they want to be able to process their data in a standard way, they want their data to be able to be analyzed across different consortia, maybe they want it visualized in different tools of different consortia, but we don't necessarily want multiple copies of it. These are separable topics, but I'm not sure that we have a large enough group that we want to separate this discussion at this point in time. Thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. Maybe we just start on one of them and get as far as we can.
So maybe one thing that we could do, I don't know, Ben, if you are how familiar are you with IHEC? In the first part of the breakout session, we were talking about IHEC mostly, and the fact that IHEC is an integration of data produced by 6, 7, or 8 different consortiums, among which is ENCODE. And maybe you can explain how the data, where the data resides, where is the data sitting, and how the coordination between the data produced at Blueprint, ENCODE, the epigenomics roadmap, how is this actually working in the IHEC? I'm not sure. Maybe you are not familiar with IHEC, but
no, I am. I've been not on every. There's basically a monthly IHEC data standards meeting of which ENCODE participates. I haven't been in all of them by a long shot, but I've definitely been a part of it. And the other issue, I'm sorry I missed the first half of this. I was just in a different session, like to check some of that stuff out. So there's it's actually interesting in terms of federation, because in terms of, so not only do we represent ENCODE at IHEC, but we also represent Roadmap, which was a Common Fund project that ended in 2012. And so I think it might be useful to discuss this as like two different classes of integration. So ENCODE essentially absorbed roadmap, and that was, I don't know if I could describe how labor intensive that project was, right? So what we did as when the common funded ended support for roadmap, they essentially transferred all the data and the metadata to us based on other groups' data coordination centers. And it probably took us 3 years with almost like an entire data wrangler to sort of sort through the mess that was roadmap, figure out what experiments were done. And remember, roadmap and ENCODE, like the investigators were very much overlapping. Like roadmap was 90% histone ChIP-seq data. A lot of it was done by Brad Bernstein's group, which was an ENCODE contributor. A lot of it was done by John Stam, who's an ENCODE contributor. But even then, it took years to sort out the other people's metadata databases and incorporate that fully into our system. We ended up doing like 90% of it, leaving out some of the array data that we didn't think anyone wanted. Turns out that actually people do want it, so we have to go back and sort that out too, but it's only like a small number of data sets. And so that's, the lesson there is that if you don't keep track of, like if your metadata is unstructured and dirty and not collected well, then no one's ever going to be able to find your data in the future ever. And it takes a lot of curation work to like unroll something out of somebody's database. So what IHEC then is IHEC is like a more federated distribution of, it's International Human Epigenetics Consortium. So it's a consortium of consortia, about, I don't even know how many there are, and I actually haven't met in person half of them, but it's, and you could go to the web portal and look it up. It's sort of, so in the US, it's sort of ENCODE and roadmap. In Canada, there's a project called CanDig and another project, I can't remember, Blueprint, and then there's a couple Asian ones as well. And so the issue, so in this case, we all had roughly the same kind of set of genomic data. So typically, they were organized in what's called a reference epigenome, which is something that came out of the roadmap project. And a reference epigenome is like kind of a fuzzy block of genomics experiments that all apply to a particular, what ENCODE calls a biosample, but in this case is typically tissues. Like a biosample is just our term for, you know, it could be a cell line, it could be a tissue, it could be an organoid. It's just sort of the grouping situation. And then, so that's so delivering the, so the first thing we did is we organized the relevant data into what's called reference epigenomes for, at ENCODE. So that actually, it's maybe a quarter, I want to say, of the data or something like that. I have to actually look up on the portal how much it is. But it's some subsection of that that can be mapped onto what I would call like a, you know, a similar framework that each of the consortia were using. And then there was a really long, probably 2-year process. Not a lot of work over 2 years, but just a really long process. You're talking like a monthly meeting, you know, across 24 time zones effectively to try to organize, you know, how to share information about our epigenomes, which is again, a pretty defined set of things. So it may be actually even more fuzzily defined than one would imagine, like a single cell mapping experiment, which is a pretty straightforward situation, depending on what kind of technical and experimental variables you need to actually capture. So the scope is about the same. And what David Buchhold and Guillaume Bork's group did in Quebec was sort of write what's called IHEC JSON, which is essentially a specification for, like in our case, a reduced representation of metadata that then applies to individual tracks that show up in a reference epigenome. And then we modified our API effectively to export this specific metadata control format, and then it gets stored in a central location there, and that's what powers the IHAC portal. If you give me 5 seconds, I'll show you what the website looks like. I'll put in the chat, and you can look at it on your own time. So this has worked pretty well, right? So I don't know how much, I don't know how often people use this as opposed to going into particular
So can I ask a question on the IHEC? You absorbed a lot of, you had to dig through all the metadata to figure out what all the data was. Does that mean you also, you absorbed all the raw data and that you had to organize?
Oh, for roadmap, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for roadmap. So we actually did, yeah, we actually, I forget where it was stored originally, but yeah, so the way the ENCODE consortium works is that we're the data coordination center sits in the middle, and then labs effectively submit their metadata to us and their raw data. And then sometimes they submit their process data, but for like stuff like chip or DNA-seq or RNA-seq experiments, we actually run the processing locally at the DCC. We actually run in the cloud, but locally. And so what we did for the roadmap project is we submitted it to ourselves. So we actually created metadata objects for each experiment, and then we submitted that, and then we submitted all the raw data files and the process data files too. So we did clone it completely. As far as I know, I think what we did is the person to talk to about this for sure is Jason Hilton, who's in another call, because he actually did a lot of this work. Most of the data we pulled actually out of Geo or SRA, but we collect a local copy of it because part of our mission is to avoid people having to use Geo or SRA. We do archive everything in ENCODE that comes in, and we send it to them to Geo as well. There was a bit of a, if you care about sort of genetic privacy concerns, which I'm sure you all really do. So ENCODE is blessed in that we have an open genomic policy that essentially all experiments done for ENCODE are freely consented to be downloaded pure raw sequence data. So that saves a lot of security hassles on our end. However, this wasn't really true of roadmap. There were probably a couple dozen experiments where we had to, the raw data was protected and in dbGaP. And so we had to actually apply to get it out of dbGaP to reprocess it, and then basically come up with a system to sort of phantomize the BAM files and the FASTQ files on our system, and then purge them from our system and leave them back in dbGaP. But we completely cloned it, and it's all in Amazon right now.
Okay, so there's still multiple copies of that data around at Geo, dbGaP, and in ENCODE roadmap /IHEC.
Yeah. So we have one bucket that's all put together. Yeah, and then it's all in Geo as well. I don't know if people still get stuff out of Geo, but I guess they do. I think that's probably a pretty minimal set. It also gives you, there's some sense of future horrific security, data security issues, right? If somehow Amazon was wiped off the face of the earth, I mean, that seems less likely than Geo getting wiped off the face of the earth, but things can happen. There would be another copy of it somewhere. We also, yeah, so there's 2 copies of everything, I would say.
So I was wondering, thank you very much for that description of what you had to do with the data there and moving it. And so we know that having appropriate metadata and provenance for the data is going to be important for its maintenance long term. And if you have any migration events, that would be part of it. So part of this question, though, where did data live and do you move it around? If we go back to some of our discussion in part one, it was partly that people want to have their data shareable across different consortia. And so perhaps we could discuss a little bit about how we break this down and what the different issues or aspects of this are. First of all, there's the raw data storage. Second, there would be process files and processing pipelines, and the fact that different places may want to process data differently, or there may be common processing pipelines that can be used to make data comparable. Are there what other major aspects? I guess access for people to be able to use data from different consortia in visualization tools. So those are our three components of this that we could discuss. Does that sound, does anybody have any others?
So Carol, the security issue might also impact the raw data because visualizations a lot of times are derived data sets. And so the security may not be as big a concern as it is for reprocessing raw data.
Mm-hmm.
And could I use the word visualization partly as saying processing? I mean, to me, it's just another process on the data.
Sure.
I guess I was combining visualization with access.
Yeah.
But processing would require access as well.
Yeah. Sometimes for me, though, sometimes for me, the visualization is immediate access. Someone's visualizing something through a web tool and they need to get to it through the browser. So it's both access and timeliness of access to the data.
Yeah. So just going back to sort of looking at the collective wisdom, and I guess what Carol is getting at are different levels of data, and the number of users who use different levels of data tend to be different. Like for instance, the number of people who are going to go get the raw data and reprocess it can be counted on two hands, whereas the people who actually do the visualization could be in the thousands, right? And so there's a difference in scale and the number of users you target based on these data levels. So as sort of, do IHEC or any of these other consortia kind of look at the levels of data and kind of work more on one kind than the other? Because they may say, no, look, we don't really care about raw data as long as we can sort of make our process data available.
For sure, I left that out. IHEC only works at the high-level process data, so it only shares. Well, actually, I mean, it of course doesn't copy them. It just has links effectively to big WIG files and big bed files, I believe, is the only thing that it really tracks. I should probably cross, that would be my guess. And in fact, the IHEC JSON format or schema that we ended up using is really more of a genome browser configuration spec.
So it's kind of like Track Hub kind of thing.
Well, in fact, there was some brief discussion a few months ago from Santa Cruz where they were thinking about adopting it to make sort of a more so between Santa Cruz and University of Washington Epigenome browser to sort of come up, because they both have their own specs, to come up with effectively a more universal Track Hub JSON descriptor.
Okay. And the reason I bring up this data levels, right, is because movement of data when it's processed data is a lot simpler in terms of bandwidth requirements. Whereas if you're trying to sort of move raw data for reprocessing, it's a completely different scale. And so one is really possible, the other is almost difficult, right?
Yeah, for sure. I don't think, so the one thing that I think that is related to this, I don't know if this is on your folks' radar as well, but we have a fair number. We recently, I would say like last year, signed a deal with Amazon to make ENCODE into what's called an open data set, which they pay for actually hosting an egress of that. Which is a good deal if you can get it. I think it's for ENCODE something like $14,000 a month. but what's really interesting is we have a lot of users, and in fact, specifically Anvil and I think there's another group that's associated with them at the Broad. Terra, that's what it's called. Their cloud computing is all on Google Cloud. So it sort of defeats a lot of the purpose is if you're computing on Google Cloud to then basically pay to suck the data over from Amazon. So they actually, it's Terra, I believe, has like some sort of miniature mirror of ENCODE where they put on Google Cloud so that they can resell it to other people. And for a while, NIH was kind of claiming that we had to sort of support both users on Google and Amazon from a cloud computing standpoint, but they never really made it an official requirement. And this is like literally doubles your storage costs. So I'm not really sure like how, like this is a problem that, you know, is at a very high pay grade, right? In terms of how to sort out, someone needs to sign basically a deal that like with essentially Microsoft, Google and Amazon and like for scientific computing to say like, okay, you know, you all get a little piece of this, but you all have to host like mirrors of the data because it's just going to fractionate the community a little bit. Or
I think that would be a fantastic thing to come out of this consortia to try and push towards, right?
You're going to need like, I mean, it's a lot of money. You're going to need Francis or somebody to do it. Right?
But that's precisely the kind of thing I think we could push forward as part of a subgroup saying that that's the kind of thing, because I don't see another solution around it. Either you choose a cloud and stick to it, or the other solutions would be to get academic and other partners to create a distributed storage cloud.
Yeah, just to give you an idea on the NEMO side, right? We originally, when we wrote the grant, we said we would be using AWS for our data storage needs. And then when we got into the consortium and we started having discussions with HCA, and for which a lot of the processing is actually done at the Broad and the Terra platform, we switched our cloud provider from Amazon to Google just so that we didn't have to replicate the costs and make it more of a seamless integrated ecosystem, right? And so those are some of the kind of decisions we made, but I don't know if those are necessarily the right ones.
It's probably better than ours. What we actually do for our sort of current generation pipelines is we are running them all on Google Cloud. So we transfer the files from Amazon to Google Cloud, run them in Google Cloud, then submit them back to Amazon and delete them from Google Cloud. And this is just having to do with the fact that our pipelining system, while technically works on Amazon, works a lot better and is a lot more seamless. We use Cromwell sort of in there, which is Cromwell. Cromwell is a Broad product. Broad is very tightly integrated with Google. It just works better there. But we sort of can get away with that because, again, our public data house is being paid. So Amazon is actually paying for us to transfer the data to Google. There's no one from Amazon's on this call, right?
Hopefully not. What does the HCA do? I know that there was some talk about replicating on multiple clouds, but I know that part of the pipeline only worked on AWS. So can somebody comment on what's happening with HCA data?
So I can tell you from the hub map perspective, our plan, so we haven't done a data release yet. So we don't really have the real users that we're looking for coming and wanting to use the data yet. But our plan is to house it in one place. And if you need it somewhere else for compute, you move whatever data you need for compute. Your whatever data sets you need for compute. Now, how large that will be yet, I don't know. If it's multiple terabytes of data, might not work as well. But we did some calculations when we put this in. And so our plan for that is to move it, compute on it, and then blow it away. Sort of similar to what Ben was talking about. And when you do that, the ingest charge is usually free on these cloud services. You move it there, you store it, you pay to store it for however long you need to store it to compute on it, and then you delete it, right? And so you don't ever get the egress charges. which is what really starts to add up for these. So that's our plan for HubMap. We haven't done any of this yet because we haven't had our first data releases coming in this summer. So that's just what we're talking about now. So
yeah, in terms of cloud solutions, I'll point out that Wasabi, which is another platform out there, is now providing free ingress and egress. So you're just paying for storage costs. And they're trying to be as competitive as possible with all of the other cloud providers. So again, there are solutions, I think, that come up as a result of this. And that, again, might provide a way of conversing with Amazon and Google to say, if you maintain mirrors, we don't need to do this to move out to a different storage platform. So there might be a sort of mechanism to get these cloud providers to do certain things.
But sort of stepping back though, I mean, my original question was, how often do we think, right? There are two levels of data. Process data tends to be an order of magnitude or orders of magnitude smaller than the raw data. And so maybe we need to sort of discuss the split. This is two-part problem, right? I mean, it doesn't cost that much to replicate the process data on multiple clouds if people want to be cloud native in each of their clouds. Whereas trying to replicate raw data in every cloud is a huge bill for the taxpayer at the end of the day.
Right. So one of the questions I think that comes up there is the stability of the processing. Right. So in many cases, that processes are not validated processes all the time. So people want to recompute. Yes, the vast majority will be using some of the derived data or the process data, but every time you recompute, that requires access to the raw data. So the raw data is still the pristine data that needs to be stored and archived somewhere.
Absolutely, yeah. Don't get me wrong. We're not saying that that's not necessary, but I'm saying in terms of data movement, right? I mean, it's like a few people moving the data over a 5-year period is different than it's a process data where lots of people are going to be moving it all the time.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that one can think about is, except for unique processes, I would say even processes on process data can be shared, right? So if you just think of derivatives at every level across a data flow graph, things could be hashed, people can reuse at the most opportunistic point of transform. And that would also save movement quite a bit. And for consortia, one of the questions that came up in the earlier section was creating standardized pipelines and analysis. That kind of reduces the necessity even to reprocess data downstream.
Yeah, I mean, there may be valid reasons, right? Like, for instance, reference genomes change and some other annotation changes. And so there may be occasional reasons for reprocessing the data. But I haven't heard any from HCA.
So another session.
Pardon me?
I have to pop over to another session. I'll check back.
All right, thanks, Ben. So is anybody there from HCA who can comment on where their data is stored and what their policies are?
I mean, there is this DCP, the data coordination platform, that has these components in different sites, where they are actually they have designed this this system in which there are different components from data ingestion to data processing to data. I forgot actually the details to data providing, and of course I think within HCA. The idea is that all data is dealt with the DCP, the data coordination platform, and essentially the plan is to, my understanding is that the plan is to use standard protocols, standard pipelines, standard data formats to process all the data produced within HCA.
Okay. Yeah, we have some familiarity with HCA because when we first started NEMO, we were actually looking at the HCA DCP for hosting the data and ingesting it into NEMO. Yeah. And at that point, I know that the data was getting ingested into AWS, and then some of the processing was being done in GCP and then moved back to AWS. So they were essentially mirroring their data in both the clouds. I don't know if that's still true today, but that was at least a year and a half ago.
I don't know. I don't know now. Yeah.
Okay.
So since we have 40 minutes left, I think we have a number of topics still to hit here. I'm wondering if we can close out a piece on the different cloud platforms and the processing pipelines and come up with any concrete actions that we think we could take in order to have better alignment across consortia? Or I see even in here some places where we could see if we could ask NIH for help with how we get different cloud platforms to work together with these problems with having things on Google versus Amazon. Are there any things that are on our wish list, whether they're things that we can do together or things that we can ask for help with to try to get companies to find solutions for us?
Carol, could I add one more thing to that statement? So there is a final template, which is how we can do certain things as well. Mm-hmm. And so just keep that in mind as you, as everybody kind of thinks about this, is mm-hmm. how data providers, et cetera, can coordinate and collaborate on solving some of these problems. If the answer is we cannot solve it without extra resources, that would be good to let people know. But I think it would be important for us to say, which of these problems can we solve? And I know at least there are a few data providers over here, and I know some of it is going to come up in the next question, which is on how do you find data? And maybe that's the one which is easier to tackle across data providers at this point in time, rather than the storage and reprocessing issue.
I'd like to try to come up with a few items for our wish list, either things that we can solve or we can ask for help with.
Right. I completely agree that asking NIH at least to do the high-level coordination across cloud platforms would be nice. And I know the NIH Strides program is trying to do some of that. I just don't know how far they're striding across cloud platforms.
Say that again, what was that?
They're not, at least for what I've heard, they're not. They just, it's a mechanism for reducing the costs, and you still need to pick your platform that you want to store the data.
This is the NIH Strides platform. But they're not really solving the technical problems. They're kind of doing budget negotiations, I think.
Yeah.
So this is essentially, we have a contract with both Amazon and Google, where we have an account where we would pay for the computing cost that you incur. This is like more like a credit card that we already have paid them. So we have an account with them. And if you have incurred some cost, you can be really paid back for that. So but Anup is right. Anup is right. What he said is that we are not trying to solve that other problem. Yeah, Anup, were you asking something?
Yeah, so in the internal discussions, how do you as program officers feel about data being replicated on the clouds to solve this problem of data movement? Or is that discouraged and you want everybody to sort of pick a cloud and stick with it?
I think it's the latter.
Okay.
So far, but it's still an ongoing discussion.
Okay.
So there is an issue though that we need to, to be aware of. Something that we can do is that at least the HCA is an international consortium with data being produced at very different sites. And there are issues that are legally different in Europe, at least in the United States, concerning data protection. So some of the human cell atlas samples will actually, well, no, they will come from individuals, right? And the laws governing release of data in Europe are now different than those in the United States. We have this DGPR thing, and this sets some constraints to the way in which the data can be, I guess, not necessarily centralized. I actually have no idea whether Google or Amazon are considered now global companies, and that's not an issue, but there's something that may actually at some point have some impact on the way in which the data is being shared, and about the possibility of having common sites for all the data produced across the world.
That's a good point to bring up. Yeah, because the European laws require that the data does not leave the EU, right? That's kind of another requirement.
No. I don't think that's needed, but you need different ways of consenting. So the individuals that consent to the data, they have some sort of rules for consenting for how the data has to be consented. And some other countries, I may be wrong or not, but some other countries, I believe like India or so, are very reluctant to send the data outside from the borders of the country.
Yeah. So the data needs to, for India, the data needs to stay hosted in India. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Okay. So
I'm
that's
not
a
sure that's the
distributed
case, but
access
I think
control
that,
and distributed. Yeah. So from a like a technical perspective, that's both access control and distributed storage that we would have to deal with, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to the, I'd like to see if we can populate a wish list or what we can do so we can move on to the next topic. Is there some expectation that we would ask for pressure to be put on some of the cloud compute platforms to have better movement or easier or cheaper movement of data from one storage platform to another processing pipeline? Are there possibilities there? I'm not an expert in this area, so I'm not sure.
I think it's worth trying to get someone to have that conversation anyway. So I'll sort of second that as a goal. I think Satra put it out there first, so I'll second it.
And I don't know if this would kind of be redundant or counterintuitive in light of wanting to just reach out for I'm looking at the names here, as Bill and Satra have been mentioning, but I wonder, as sort of a wish list, if there's a way to expose raw data in a wherein accessing it doesn't require disk storage. So leveraging, this may be more technical too, but leveraging, for instance, random like a BAM file or SAM file is compressed and organized for random access of all these different parts of it. Like, is there a way to do that for these data sets that we're putting into the HCA, wherein any given data set is just, you can grab what you need without having to really store data, having to even really store data in Google Storage or S3 or, so I guess my question maybe is there from more of the software side, data side, is there a better way to store data where it resides to make it readily available and bypass having to, work out negotiations for this between cloud storage?
Right. So I think that that's what we're making I think I am and Anoop is making we're thinking that, to move the data, the network's going to be slow, so you have to move it. And so I think that's the real issue there, John, is if you want to compute on that data and do it in a timely fashion, I think that you can share data. There are technologies now that you can use to share data, across the network from one to another. It's just that it's going to be slow enough that it's not going to be worth it. It's better to zip that data up, move it, and then do the compute on it. And so I think it's more of a network issue than a software issue at that level.
So then I may have misunderstood from I'm relatively new to this initiative, so I apologize if I'm maybe going back over things, but in essence, we're envisioning this being sort of a centralized access application place wherein network bombardments would really be an issue, or is this something that's going to be really client side will handle a lot of the, access, and in essence, then the network constraints will be spread out across thousands, millions of compute nodes, wherein, so I guess, is that make sense what I'm asking, I guess? Is there a centralized place where everyone's going? And yeah, network could be a real issue if this, one app is trying to pull in all this data, but if it's decentralized from a client side, could that?
To channel Owen a little bit, I don't think data will ever get centralized. It's going to be in different consortial places with different pieces of this existing in different, each of these consortia may put things on AWS, so you can kind of think of centralization at a cloud level. But other than that, I think data are going to live in different places, and different kinds of data that's going to come online are going to live in different places. So not all data, I think, are going to move to one central archive.
And compute is not going to be central either. So, compute's definitely going to be distributed as well. So it's the...
Yeah, I mean, I know we weren't going to discuss that, but there's that whole section about pipelines and whether we can actually move the pipelines to the data, right? And in some ways that might be more tractable, particularly with things like Docker containers and these common workflows, which are now sort of standardized. You can, it might be that you sort of just take your computes to where the data reside, and then you sort of just take the results, which are always smaller, or tend to be smaller.
I was just quickly going to bring up, I know there's another subtopic on data format, and we are not covering that, but I think that's another place where some of that solution could come, right? That you only access the relevant pieces needed for compute. The way many of the structures are set up for data, you have all kinds of data that you don't need to access, but have to move to compute on. And so there might be other things that come out from that subgroup that says you could reduce the compute burden or the network burden by accessing pieces of data that's necessary.
I think we saw the efficacy of that in the COVID-19 presentation, where they pulled 3 genes of expression data from a ton of different places, right? And that is impactful. So just to throw that in there.
So I wanted to try to finish this up, and let's see if we can just pull out a couple things that we can do as a consortium to close this out. I think one of the things that in the BICCN we're interested in, and with the HCA, is this use of common transcriptomic and epigenomic platforms, or processing pipelines is the one thing that we're trying to do. And this is something we don't have HubMap in, for instance, but something we could do is try to include HubMap in some discussion here, so that you could look at some of the common processing pipelines we're trying to deploy. We're all, right now, a lot of this is helped by the fact that our processing pipeline is being done at the Broad Institute by the same people. So it's the same group working in HCA and BICCN for some of this, so that makes it easier to do some coordination on the processing pipelines. But if we can bring in other consortia into that too and get some larger community buy-in on those, that would be great. We haven't deployed those pipelines yet in the BICCN. This is something that's been in development, and hopefully we'll be close to doing it. Maybe we're running a little bit out of time, so we don't have a lot of time to go into this further, but this is some place where we can continue to follow up with HubMap at least. And I don't know if there are other consortia on the call right now who would be interested in tapping into that. Anyone?
I'll speak for HubMap and say that we definitely would be in, or I could connect to them. I'm not the right person, but I could connect to the right people.
Yeah, so apart from the HubMap, I think HTAN, Kidney Precision Medicine, some of the other NIH initiatives working in the same space would be very interested.
Okay. And so maybe you could write those consortia, and we would need contact names and the names of those consortia in here in the Google Docs if you can add them.
Right.
Great.
So the names of those consortia is in the first slide that Richard showed, but I'll be happy to share those with you along with the names.
Okay, great. Okay, so if we move along now, because we have 23 minutes left in the session, and it's a hard stop. As you'll recall, we all got kicked out from the part 1 session right on time. That's how they keep us on track. So do we want to talk? We have a couple topics that we could talk about now, and I think first would be talking more about how we access data across platforms, because part of the motivation for moving data and mirroring it in multiple places is so that you can analyze it across other data and present it or visualize it or access it in the same in different contexts. So BICCN wants to look at all this data in the BICCN context, but then HubMap wants to look at it across potentially all organs of the body, as does HCA, right? So can we solve some of these things where maybe we don't need to move it, or what data needs to be shared? We talked a little bit about in the earlier bit about stable processing. If the processing is very stable, then people can share access to a processed version, and that solves some of the issues about where data is stored. So I'm wondering if we can hit this topic for a few minutes before we move on to the how do you find data, how do you have a common inventory across data sets. So maybe we could talk just a little bit about access to data separately from inventory of data, so accessing for analysis. Does anybody have any thoughts they want to raise here on things we might be able to do in this space?
So I'll speak a little bit from the Dandy side. One of the things we are looking at is different levels of access. So kind of data set level access, individual file level access, or individual subcomponent within file level access. Because again, for certain visualizations, part of it is how much time it takes to get access to things to visualize it. And some people will do that by processing and then generating a visualization. And certain things can be done kind of on the fly. Some of the COVID things that we see right now are direct access to databases that are responding to some levels of things. This is not going to go across scale of all the types of data that the HCA or the NIH, this consortium will concern, but kind of thinking about common protocols to access different levels. And unfortunately, I think this is tied to how do you find it, so the inventories of it. So I don't think they're kind of unrelated questions. We will have to tackle the other one to achieve, but at least at the access level, if across consortia, we could figure out that there has to be a layer that each consortia provides to access data at different levels, then that could be something that the consortia could work towards.
Another point though.
Can I raise just one quick question here, and just to think about? I'm not prescribing any particular directions, but would it make sense not just to think about the kinds of data we are thinking about, but many of the initiatives that we have coming together for this meeting are organ specific? For instance, kidney map or hub map looking at various organs, a lung map looking at lung. Would it make sense not just to think about the data types, but also organ specific data?
That's a good point, because people may coalesce around different technologies for different organs, right? Or different ways.
Exactly. And so for instance, people who are interested in clinical aspects or particular organ specific notions, then they might find that more interesting than just looking at the data types.
That's a good point. And Carol, the other thing, just sort of, so we at least we've covered it, and we I don't know we'll have time to discuss it, but when you talk about data access, a big part of it is how do you map the consent to data access? Because a lot of times that's kind of what the stumbling block is. It's not the technology, but it's the consent, and how do you reflect that in the data sets? So there needs to be, I know that the GA4GH consortium is sort of talking about having standardized consent, so they can map the consent to data access so that it will all be done machine processing. And so that's something to sort of think about in the consortium, because that's going to be a big issue.
And one of the things I can point to, just in terms of logical open view.
Satra, you've cut out a bit. Oh, we've lost his video too.
Yeah.
Did I lose everyone?
We lost
Yes, you did.
Okay. I was going to bring up openhumans.org, which is an organization focused on personal data stores. And so the consent process happens at the point of somebody trying to access somebody's data. And I think this kind of blends quite nicely with GDPR regulations and other things as well. So each person's data is stored in an account with appropriate inventory and other things. Me as a researcher comes to Open Humans and says, I'm interested in genomic data and Fitbit data. I'm just going to use that as an example because they have both of those. And so that sends out an email to the consortium members saying, here you can have access to this data. So that's a different model. And again, we're not saying these models will change overnight across consortia, but that's a model that addresses a lot of the access pieces, as well as the privacy and individual level data and longitudinal data, which I think we're not talking about a whole lot of right now, but will become much more relevant across some of these projects and consortia.
So what are some of the things, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, this particularly becomes more relevant in the future when we start bringing in, right now, a lot of these projects, right, are generating data from what are quote unquote typical humans or typical models, right? These are not disease focused data set yet, but eventually that's kind of where the field is going to go. And there these consent issues become much larger.
Yeah, and together with the clinical metadata that's going to come alongside the biosample based data.
Okay, so I'm wondering if there are some definitive steps we could do here, or we can just start talking, close out at the end of this and talk for another few minutes about inventorying data before we find the list of things that we can do. Should we do that? If these issues are somewhat tied together? Okay. So in the how do you find data and having joint inventories, I guess one thing that I would say about this is that for that use case, data is generated by the same labs, belong to multiple consortia, and they want data to be accessible in multiple places. Being able to find the data using having common information about the data sets in different places would be useful. But also, I mean, just in general, in order to be able to reuse data or analyze data, you might not need to replicate everything so much if you can find it. It's more complicated than that, obviously, but what are some of the things we want to solve for in this space? Let's just throw out some brief things for what are the things we want to solve for in this inventory space.
Well, I think that there are at least two models and two things that are being tried out. Right? There are some places, for instance, like I'm talking about RNA-seq, like the expression atlas at the European Bioinformatics Institute, but they are actually trying to compile all available experiments, not single cell, that was all RNA-seq experiments initially, and try to process them in a standard way, so that essentially every experiment carried out or published or something, it's reprocessed and have a uniform view to the world. And now they actually have the single cell expression atlas, but they are also trying again to reprocess all the single cell experiments and provide in a centralized place, right, the access to a commonly processed set of experiments. And then there is the Global Alliance model, right, which they are actually trying to develop APIs that actually are able to, or protocols or standards that make actually possible to access the data wherever, if you have the appropriate query, and the data may actually be processed in different ways in different places, but still you may be able through these beacons or things like that to be able actually to ask where particular data exists, and you may get actually information on the places around the world in which the data may reside. I think that these are two things that are being now tried or work out, and there are two different models. I think the decentralized model is very good, but it is unrealistic as the amount of data is growing, and also because of the restrictions to the way in which the data can be, as we talked before, data can be released in different countries, and whether this is for medical purposes or for research purposes, right? So the Global Alliance is more through access data that has been produced, not necessarily for research purposes, but for medical purposes in hospitals, in the clinic environment. And so this data is very difficult to get centralized into a single place and process uniformly, and that's what I think.
Okay. So do we have any other use cases that we can kind of put into that for things that we're trying to solve for how we're finding the data? With relation to data storage and data movement, I guess I would just reiterate that if we can find the data in different places, it may make it less necessary to have to mirror the data everywhere. There are different reasons for mirroring, obviously, but I think everything we're doing in this session, we're trying to look at this data storage and data movement. Some of it is there are necessary moves of data, and there might be use cases that are requiring moves of data that we might be able to avoid if we can better inventory.
So Carol, somewhere over there, I feel like convergence, or at least use of common ontologies from metadata would be a good way to find data, right? Like essentially if let's say there's a kidney project in Europe and a kidney project in the US, and if they can at least converge or have a mapping and the ontologies used to mark it up, then machines can find it. If you don't converge on that, then it gets a lot harder. And so I don't know, I want to hear what, I know HubMap was planning on sort of working on that space as well, and I'm sure HCA is working as well. So it'd be sort of nice to see if there's an effort to kind of work jointly on that aspect of it. I know that there are in the second half of the day, there's metadata schemas and ontology sessions, and part of it we're going to talk about federation of standards, and then there's another session on subtopic on common metadata schemas, as well as there's a couple other subtopics in that session as well. One question that I have for this inventory of data sets across places is it that people need to adopt wholesale
wholesale the same fields? Is the mapping sufficient? And is there anywhere, currently a resource anywhere that maps terms for you across different things? I know harmonization is not what people want necessarily. People would like everyone to adopt the same thing and agree on using the same thing. But until that is the case, is there a place where you can have these mappings, kind of like, you know, the Uberon cross-species anatomy ontology has been working on trying to map Uberon to different anatomy ontologies that exist. People have different ways of modeling data, and that's never going to end, I think. But is there a way that we can have, is there any source or an example of that where people are mapping how different consortia are recording their data?
We're actually doing that within HubMap now. We're just starting the effort where we're using both Uberon and UMLS. You know, so UMLS has multiple terminologies, ontologies from different places. They pull it in and they're cross links. So we've created a graph database that has all the linkages there. But depending on the domain that you're in, you have to add, you know, you have to keep adding other ontologies and things like that. So we're trying to do that for HubMap across all the different data types that we're going to get. And so we'll just do it. The plan is to just do it piece by piece. As we get another piece of data that we can't find the terms or an ontology describing what, you know, what we're seeing in this data, that we'll add this to this resource that we have in HubMap now. So we are starting that. We're just in the initial phases of just starting to think and implement something around that. But one of the PIs on my project has a lot of experience with this and is doing this now.
So this seems like an area that could be good where multiple consortia can make sure that they're coordinating on their approach to how we are mapping into terms, mapping into ontologies, et cetera.
Right, right.
But I feel like what's missing is like a central space for us to kind of.
I think we need that shared. We need that shared ontology resource or whatever, because there are ontologies out there for everything, but there's that shared piece that you know, cross consortia could, you know, you could come to this to map your terms and you know, tag things.
So on that front, Bill, I think part of this would be lovely for a consortia of this size to come together on, because that's the part which is hard, right? People have said, I like this ontology and not that one. And that's usually been the killer mechanism to kill every ontology.
I have it tagged in this one, but so what we're doing, you could actually have multiple ontologies that represent the same thing and have linkages between them.
So some of the things that we have been looking at are more about terminologies rather than ontologies. We can often agree on items that we are describing rather than the structure of relations between them.
Right, so I'm using the word ontologies, but it's more terminologies. You're right.
And that might be a shared space for us to agree on. The other piece I would like to bring up, and this relates to the finding of data, is a lot of these places which provide processed data don't provide any provenance alongside it. So often you have to kind of dig in to know how the data was processed, to which reference thing, or it's in a text description somewhere. And I think that's another place where we could align, which is as we describe these data sets, adopt some specific vocabulary for describing pieces.
We actually, so HubMap, I don't know, 6 months or so ago, we did a couple meetings with HCA where we tried to normalize the provenance, you know, just the structure of the provenance that we're getting. And we're pretty close there, I think. And we did some back and forth, although there was never, I don't think there was any finalization of, okay, we're tracking this and you're not. Should you be tracking that? And we're tracking this and you're not. So
one thing that I'd like to, I was going to switch to something else. So Anup, if you want to follow up on this, go ahead.
No, I just sort of sent you a private message. I was just looking at the clock and we have 7 minutes. And so there's some things that are expected to be filled in the blue box. I just wanted to make sure that we can address some of those. So I'll let you lead. I just want to remind you, that's all.
I had one other little thing that I thought tied into the topic of shared data across the different consortia. and we probably don't have a lot of time to talk to this, but I'm thinking about the way that different consortia want to be able to access and visualize data. And if you could, if everybody, besides having shared metadata about what are the data sets, what's in them, if you could have a version of something that different people could launch from different servers. I'm thinking here kind of like how you can make a file for a genome browser, and you could serve that up somewhere that anybody could pull to visualize in a viewer at different places, right? That there might be different ways for some of these files, or if there were mechanisms for people to store something, a process version of something, and people agreed on some of the standards for those process versions of things to stand them up, so that multiple consortia websites, analysis tools, visualizations could access them and people could look at them in an easy way. That sounds like many NIH grants that could be funded to develop those formats for other data types along the way, or maybe it's not special data types, maybe it's just a way of figuring out how we create something akin to a track hub that's easy for people to pull data from, and some good framework for making data easily reusable in different tools and visualizations. But we can move on to the blue box. Anup, did you have something? Did you look at this already a little bit more? Do you want to say anything about closing out?
No, I just wanted us to be on time. That's all.
Okay,
So
5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Okay, problems we think we can solve by collaborating. Who populated this box? Was that Satra?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, whichever anonymous animal I was.
Go ahead. Why don't you go ahead and walk through what you put in here?
All right, so I was just taking some of the notes that came up. So common processing pipelines to minimize data generation and movement. So if people can do that across consortia, it serves a few things. We get common processing pipelines, and it also reduces data generation and movement. Common standards for data inventories. I think this is a large space that's actually an easier space where one can do this because this kind of creates almost, it's like, you don't need to change anything underneath. You need to create a shim exposing information that you have in a common way. And that could be something that's easier to do than restructuring whole architectures under the hood. Coming up with a common shared terminology, I think would also be good. I think it's just having a place where we can look at things we agree on and things we disagree on. And perhaps if there's a lot of agreement actually that we just don't think about, and also isolating things that we disagree on gives us a space to kind of get to a consensus around this. And then the last thing that you brought up, I think, was this idea of a common API across data stores. So this, again, a lot of this is really looking at shims that sit at a technological level across whatever data architecture data you have, and provides a way of accessing information in some kind of standardized way. Mm-hmm. And then each thing underneath can continue to evolve to kind of merge closer to these shims, but that at least provides a way where the internals don't need to change overnight. And that might be an easier sell at a consortial level.
Okay. So for closing this out, I think we had one action item for follow-up discussion on processing pipelines. And right now this is just for transcriptomics, epigenomics. Is a very specific thing we can talk about. And we, for BICCN with HubMap, HCA is using the same processing pipeline. We just need to talk a little bit more, I think, about on how, what we'd like to see in this space, and then looking at bringing in potentially other consortia as well.
And I think we could do the same exact thing for terminologies as well. It's kind of just, and that can come up at the data inventory level across these consortia.
Data inventory standards. So this is kind of like the data site standards for
a
data
set.
set.
It's just that data site is, yeah. So if we can align on how we expose information about data, that would be a great place for search, right? The devil will always be in the details because people don't want to just know there is data. They want to access very specific, like the 3 genes that you referred to, John. And kind of working through that problem is something we can do to expose at least some use cases.
But then we still have a problem on how to make this searchable across consortia. And that's something where there needs to be one Uber index somewhere.
Technologically doesn't have to be, but possibly that's a good place to start.
Is there another follow-up action item we could have? We have 1 minute left. We're about to get kicked out. Who's interested in participating on the common processing pipelines from this meeting?
So you can put me as a contact, but I will put it up. I'll ask someone else in HubMap to be involved in it because I'm not the expert there.
Okay, and we'll try to get some other contacts for other consortia. How about for the data inventory standards? Who from this group is willing to follow up? I mean, I will.
Add me there.
Yeah. And I think the same goes there for me for HubMap.
Okay.
You can just put my name, but I'll. I'm the only one from HubMap on here, I think. So I feel like we should be involved.
Okay, is that all we've got? Can we do anything else?
If we can do both of those things, we will have changed a significant chunk of what people do.
And if we can do the second one, that helps to enable common, well, not completely.
Yeah, it does.
It helps to enable common APIs. It's a first step before we get to that.
I mean, I just don't want to take on everything within this small group, but we can say, I mean, that's around the problem. So common APIs is listed. And maybe as we expand out and reach back out to our own consortia in various ways, we can say some folks can come together to do the common API bits.
Okay, I think we're out of time. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you for taking notes, Satra. It's been excellent talking with you all, and I'm sure I'll be in future meetings with you over the next day and a half.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you guys. Carol, I'm going to miss yours because I'm moderating a session during that same time. So
which one do you have?
I have molecular profiling analysis, which I know nothing about.
One for you to moderate. Okay.
Yeah. But it seems like they have the same problems we face in every other analysis thing. So,
oh, good.
But it was a weird one. I told them I know nothing of this, but
well,
but otherwise I would have joined the metadata one because I think that's critical to all of these things.
And I'd like to be in multiple of the subtopic groups for the metadata one, but I'm going to be in the federated standards one because it's driving me up a wall.
Yeah. Well, I'll let you guys go towards some solutions towards it.
Okay. Take care.
All right. See you. Take care.